You know, usually when we talk about, like, adopting a new lifestyle or a personal philosophy,
Mm.
there's this underlying expectation of optimization.
Oh, for sure. Everything has to add value.
Right. We live in an era that is just obsessed with engineering the perfect life. You find a life hack, you download a productivity app, you start cold plunging or whatever.
You track your sleep cycles, right?
Exactly. You implement some new habit stacking routine, and suddenly everything is just supposed to be smoother. The jagged edges of your day just sort of, I don't know, buff out.
It's all about addition. I mean, we are so culturally conditioned to seek out things that enhance what is already there.
Yeah,
We basically want an upgrade to the existing operating system of our lives.
that's a great way to put it.
Right.
Because you remain in the driver's seat.
Right. If a philosophy or a religion doesn't immediately yield some measurable return on investment, like better mental health, better finances, better relationships, we just discard it.
Yeah, it's like you're the CEO of your life.
Yeah.
And you're just bringing in different consultants to help the company run a little better.
Exactly.
But then you step into the ancient text we're looking at today, and suddenly that whole optimization paradigm isn't just challenged. It is completely and utterly shattered.
Oh, it is dismantled.
We are looking at a message that is the exact opposite of a life hack. It is honestly terrifying to the modern ear.
Because it is the absolute definition of a complete, unyielding demand for self-execution.
Right.
The text doesn't offer a strategy for making your life better. It offers a mandate for ending your life as you know it. It demands the resignation of the CEO.
Wow. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, everyone. I am thrilled you are joining us today because the mission of this deep dive is going to take us into some incredibly profound and frankly challenging territory.
It really is.
We are taking a massive stack of theological sources, articles, and historical research, and we are doing an intense expository exploration of a very famous, very misunderstood biblical passage, Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38.
Which is the moment Jesus of Nazareth turns to a crowd and says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me."
And that phrase has been so diluted,
Yeah.
like so sanitized over the centuries that we have almost completely lost its original earth-shattering meaning.
Oh, absolutely. We put it on coffee mugs.
Right, or bumper stickers.
Yeah. And it is completely divorced from the blood and the wood of the first century.
And that is our goal today, to peel back those centuries of layers, to strip away the cultural familiarity, and to discover what those words actually meant when they echoed off the rocks of ancient Israel.
It's going to be heavy.
It is.
Yeah.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second. We live in a modern world saturated with information and therapeutic self-improvement. But the sources we are looking at today argue that this text offers the exact opposite.
Yeah.
This is an ancient, uncompromising call to total self-renunciation. It is a shock to the system.
We really need to set the tone right here at the start. The materials we're synthesizing today make it abundantly clear this isn't about therapeutic betterment.
Not at all.
This isn't a strategy for emotional fulfillment or achieving your best life now or finding inner peace. The text we are diving into is dealing with the absolute extremes of human existence.
Spiritual life and spiritual death.
Exactly. It is ultimate.
Before we jump into the deep end, I do need to offer a brief but vital disclaimer. The sources provided for today's deep dives make some very strong, very specific critiques regarding modern church movements.
Yeah, they do not hold back.
No, they don't. They critique contemporary theology, broader cultural ideologies, and they pull absolutely no punches. They draw some very hard lines in the sand against several massive groups.
Right.
Our job here, as your guides, is strictly to unpack and report the arguments made in these texts. We are going to impartially lay out the author's perspective so that you can fully understand the depth, the gravity, and the mechanics of the source material.
Right. We aren't here to take sides or endorse a specific theological camp or preach at you.
Exactly. We are simply here to show you exactly what these theologians are arguing and, more importantly, why they're arguing it based on their reading of this ancient text.
And the foundation of their entire argument rests on a very specific glaring contrast. A contrast between what the historical text actually demands and what modern religious culture has turned it into.
Let's start right there. The authors of our sources describe the modern era as suffering from a spiritual pandemic of self-exaltation.
It's a provocative phrase.
It really is a spiritual pandemic.
Yeah.
What exactly is the data behind a claim like that? Because they aren't just speaking anecdotally, right? They bring receipts.
Oh, they definitely bring receipts. They are pointing at a massive quantifiable disconnect between cultural profession and biblical reality.
Okay, lay it on me.
The sources rely on some striking demographic data. They specifically cite extensive studies from the Pew Research Center and the Barna Group, which track the religious landscape in America. And the data shows that while over 60% of Americans still claim some form of Christian identity, fewer than 10% actually hold to what researchers define as a biblical worldview.
So I was reading through the methodology of that Barna study in our notes, and it's fascinating how they define that biblical worldview.
It's not just a casual definition.
No, it's not just asking, do you believe in God?
Yeah.
They ask specific questions about the absolute truth of Scripture, the reality of sin, the nature of God, the necessity of grace.
Yeah.
And when you filter that 60% through those basic theological tenets, it plummets to under 10%.
Precisely. The term Christian has essentially been hollowed out. It's become a cultural identifier rather than a theological conviction.
Right.
But the data gets even more specific and, frankly, more damning for the modern church.
How so?
The sources indicate that among that broad 60% who claim the identity, there is almost no measurable statistical difference in moral conduct or financial self-sacrifice when you compare them to the completely secular, unchurched population.
That is the metric that really caught my eye.
It's wild.
If someone claims to follow a king who demands total self-denial and the forfeiture of earthly wealth for spiritual gain, you would expect their bank statements and their daily habits to look radically different from someone who believes this life is all there is.
Right. You'd expect a massive gap.
But the data says, on paper, they claim the title. But in practice, their lives, their spending, their moral choices look exactly like the surrounding culture.
They are indistinguishable. And the sources highlight another statistic that gets to the psychological root of this disconnect. 70% of modern churchgoers view faith primarily as an instrument for personal happiness.
70%.
Yeah. They don't view it as a total, unconditional surrender to the lordship of a sovereign God. They view it as a tool to achieve their own personal earthly goals.
It goes right back to the life hack analogy.
Exactly.
It's the lifestyle app. You download the Jesus app to manage your anxiety or, to find a nice community network or to give your kids some moral structure.
Right. But you never actually hand over the administrative rights to your phone.
Exactly. So how do the authors of our sources explain this? How did the modern church arrive at a place where 70% of its people view a religion of crucifixion as a tool for personal happiness?
Well, the sources argue that this is the direct result of modern evangelicalism becoming infected by several toxic, pragmatic trends over the last few decades.
Okay, like what?
They specifically name the seeker-sensitive movement, corporate pragmatism, and the prosperity gospel.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
The argument is that church leaders, desperate to grow their numbers and influence, looked at the majestic, sovereign, terrifyingly demanding gospel of the first century and realized it doesn't market well to a consumer culture.
Right. Come and die isn't a great marketing slogan.
Exactly. So they reduced it into a therapeutic self-help program.
They changed the product to fit the consumer rather than calling the consumer to change to fit the king.
Yes. You have preachers standing in multi-million-dollar arenas promising worldly prosperity, seamless earthly success, and emotional fulfillment.
It's crazy.
They are, in the words of the authors, begging carnal men to accept a painless savior who demands nothing and accepts everything.
A painless savior.
Yeah.
That is the illusion of a crossless Christianity.
It is a total fabrication, according to the sources. And the authors actually bring in a voice from the 19th century to counter this modern mindset.
Oh, the Spurgeon quote.
Yes, Charles H. Spurgeon, the famous London preacher, he saw the seeds of this pragmatism taking root even in his day.
And what did he say?
He warned his congregation with a very stark absolute. He said, "If Christ be anything, he must be everything. He will never accept a secondary place in the human soul."
He will never accept a secondary place. I love that quote. Because it exposes the fallacy of the additive mindset.
Oh, completely.
The human heart wants to build a throne for itself and then just set up a little folding chair in the corner for Jesus, just in case there's an afterlife.
Right, a little fire insurance policy.
Exactly. But Spurgeon is arguing, based on the text we're about to read, that Christ doesn't do folding chairs. He either takes the throne or he leaves the building entirely.
And that is the exact tragedy the sources say Mark 8 addresses, the universal human tendency to try and keep your autonomous life in the world, to protect your own sovereignty, while just adding a little bit of Jesus.
A strategy which, the text argues, ultimately results in forfeiting your soul in eternity.
Right.
So to really understand why treating this as a lifestyle app is so disastrous, we can't just sit here and look at modern demographic statistics. We have to travel back in time.
We do.
We need to smell the dust
Yeah.
and see the architecture of the gritty historical reality where these words were first spoken. Let's talk about the geography, because the sources make a massive deal out of the location where Jesus issues this ultimatum.
Caesarea Philippi.
Right.
The geographical context is absolutely vital here. It is not merely incidental background noise. Jesus didn't give this teaching in the temple courts of Jerusalem, and he didn't give it in a quaint, familiar Jewish fishing village around the Sea of Galilee. He marches his disciples 25 miles north, uphill, into Gentile territory, to Caesarea Philippi.
And this place was an overwhelming, imposing pagan stronghold. I was digging into the history of this region in our notes, and it wasn't just casually pagan, like a modern secular city.
Oh.
It was an epicenter of explicit, monumental idol worship. There was a massive rock face there, a cliff, and at the base of it was a gigantic cave that the ancients literally referred to as the gates of hell.
Yes, the Cave of Pan. Historically, the Greeks had established this as a major center for the worship of the god Pan.
The god of nature and chaos.
Right. Nature, chaos, and panic. That's where we get the word panic.
Yeah.
And there were niches carved right into the solid rock face where massive statues of pagan deities were placed.
Wow.
But even more significantly for our text, by the time Jesus and his disciples arrive, it had become a primary center for the imperial cult of the Caesars.
The imperial cult. Meaning they weren't just worshiping mythological figures, they were worshiping human politicians as literal gods.
Exactly. Herod the Great had built an incredible gleaming temple of white marble near that cave, dedicated to the worship of Caesar Augustus.
Oh, wow.
And later, his son Philip the Tetrarch expanded the city and renamed it Caesarea Philippi in honor of Tiberius Caesar and himself.
So put yourself in the sandals of the disciples. You are standing in a plaza, and looming over you are these colossal marble temples erected to celebrate emperor worship.
Yeah, it's intimidating.
They are architectural declarations that a human tyrant in Rome is divine and that Rome's power is absolute and eternal.
It really is a stunning juxtaposition. Think about the visual contrast here. It is cinematic.
It really.
You have Jesus of Nazareth. He is an itinerant rabbi. He has no earthly wealth. He has no standing army.
No political backing in the Senate.
Right. His followers are uneducated fishermen and tax collectors, and he is standing quite literally in the shadow of imposing marble temples built for the most powerful military dictator on the planet.
Temples that project ultimate earthly tyranny.
Exactly. And in the shadow of that architecture, Jesus declares a spiritual kingship that is going to conquer the entire world, but not through military might, through his own agonizing execution.
Wow. Jesus is contrasting the fleeting, tyrannical, violent power of earthly emperors who demand the blood of their enemies with the eternal spiritual kingship of the Son of Man who is about to shed his own blood for his enemies.
Right. And the sources point out that this visual contrast would have been incredibly potent, not just for the disciples standing there on that dusty plaza, but specifically for the original audience who first received Mark's gospel.
This is where the context gets deeply sobering. The sources spend a lot of time on the audience, and it takes this from a cool historical fact to a matter of immediate life and death. Who is actually reading or hearing this gospel when it is first circulated?
Well, based on extensive textual evidence and the testimony of early church fathers, figures like Papias of Hierapolis and Irenaeus, the Gospel of Mark, was written by John Mark, but he was acting as the scribe for the Apostle Peter.
Okay, so it's essentially Peter's eyewitness testimony.
Exactly. And the consensus is that it was composed primarily for a Gentile, specifically Roman, audience.
And the time frame of that composition changes everything. When are we talking?
This is the crucial key to unlocking the text. The date of composition is widely placed in the mid-60s AD, coming directly out of the city of Rome.
Rome in the mid-60s AD. That means we are right in the middle of the megalomaniacal reign of Emperor Nero.
Yes. And more specifically, the period following the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64.
Right, when a massive portion of the city burned to the ground.
And rumors were swirling that Nero himself had started the fire to clear land for a new palace complex. To deflect the public rage, Nero needed a scapegoat.
So he blamed the Christians.
Right. He falsely accused this small, misunderstood, marginalized sect. And the persecution that followed was catastrophic. We were not talking about social marginalization or losing a job. We are talking about brutal, psychotic, state-sponsored terror.
The sources get very graphic here in describing what these believers were facing.
They do, because you cannot understand the weight of the word cross without understanding the blood-soaked reality of the audience. Christians in Rome were being arrested by the thousands.
That's just horrific.
They were sewn into the skins of dead animals and thrown to wild dogs and lions in the amphitheaters for public entertainment.
Wow.
And most horrifyingly, the Roman historian Tacitus records that Nero had them tied to stakes, covered in pitch, and set on fire while still alive to serve as human torches to illuminate his garden parties at night.
I want that to sink in for a second. When a Roman Christian sitting in an underground house church in the mid-60s AD hears the words read aloud, "Take up your cross," they're not thinking of a piece of decorative jewelry.
No, not at all.
They aren't thinking of a metaphor for a bad day.
No, they are smelling the burning flesh of their friends and family members. To them, the cross thestauros in Greek was not an abstract theological symbol. It was the ultimate barbaric instrument of state terror.
Right.
It was engineered by the Roman Empire to inflict maximum physical agony and supreme public humiliation. It was designed to tell the population, this is what happens when you defy Rome.
We have such a sanitized, almost pathetic version of bearing a cross today. People say, oh, my boss is so demanding. Having to work late is just my cross to bear. I have this lingering head cold. It's my cross to bear.
Yeah.
The sources absolutely demolish that trivialization.
They reject it entirely because in Greco-Roman culture, crucifixion was considered an obscenity. It was so despicable, so horrific, that Roman citizens were actually exempt from it by law unless they were convicted of the absolute highest forms of treason.
Wow.
The sources quote the great Roman statesman and orator Cicero to drive home just how repulsive the cross was to the ancient mind.
I was reading the footnotes on the historical context, and that Cicero quote really stopped me in my tracks. It completely changes how we view the word today. What exactly did he say?
Well, Cicero wrote in his orations against Verres, and I will quote the source directly here, "To bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him is an abomination. To slay him is almost an act of parricide. To crucify him is what? There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed."
There is no fitting word. That is chilling coming from a Roman statesman who lived in a world where brutality, slavery, and gladiator combat were just everyday occurrences.
Right.
For him to say crucifixion is beyond language, it shows that it was the absolute basement of human degradation.
It was the ultimate erasure of a human being. The sources explain the mechanical reality of it to show exactly what Jesus was invoking.
Okay, walk me through that.
When a condemned criminal was forced to carry the patibulum, which was the massive, heavy, horizontal crossbeam, often weighing 70 to 100 pounds.
70 to 100 pounds, wow.
Yeah, carrying that through the crowded streets to the place of execution. It was a profound social signal. It signaled to every single onlooker, to their family, to their friends, that this victim had been utterly broken by the sovereign power of the state.
Right.
They were stripped of all rights, all dignity, all future plans, and they were walking a public, inescapable death march.
So when Jesus turns to the crowd in Caesarea Philippi and says, "Take up your cross," this wasn't poetry. It wasn't a clever metaphor for dealing with a tough situation or being a little bit uncomfortable.
Not at all. It was a public, irrevocable declaration of a death march. Jesus was utilizing the most severe, horrifying image of surrendered self-preservation available in the first century world.
Yeah.
He was calling them to a complete renunciation of their own lives, telling them they must be willing to endure the total reproach, the mockery, and the violence of the world for the sake of the Messiah.
With that brutal historical reality established, we have to look at the narrative flow. Because we have to ask, when exactly in the story does Jesus decide to drop this incredibly heavy truth on his followers? The timing here can't be a random accident.
It's not an accident at all. The authors of our sources dive deep into the literary architecture of Mark's gospel to answer that. They point out that Mark 8.34 through 38 is the structural hinge, the turning point, and the theological climax of the entire narrative.
The structural hinge. I always thought Mark was just a fast-paced collection of stories. How is the book actually organized?
Mark is a masterclass in literary pacing. The gospel is mathematically divided into two distinct halves. The first half, from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through chapter 8, verse 26, is entirely focused on a single question, the identity of the Messiah.
Okay.
It presents Jesus operating primarily in Galilee, demonstrating staggering divine authority. He is healing the sick, casting out legions of demons, forgiving sins, and calming chaotic storms with a word.
Right, just massive displays of power.
Exactly. And the central question the disciples are asking throughout the first half is, Who is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him?
And the disciples are really struggling to figure that out, right? Despite seeing all these miracles firsthand, they are remarkably dense.
They are spiritually dull. And the sources note a fascinating literary setup that Mark places right before our passage. It's the miracle of the blind man at Bethsaida.
Oh, this is the bizarre two-stage healing, right? Where Jesus spits on the man's eyes, asks what he sees, and the man says, I see men, but they look like trees walking.
Yes, that's the one.
And then Jesus touches his eyes a second time, and he finally sees clearly. I've always wondered why Jesus didn't just heal him instantly the first time. Was he running low on power?
Not at all. The sources argue this miracle is a living, breathing object lesson strategically placed by Mark. The blind man represents the 12 disciples.
Oh, wow. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, right. Up to this point, they can quote-unquote see Jesus, but their spiritual vision is partial, blurred, and distorted. They see the miracles, they see the power, but they don't understand the mission. They see him as a political conqueror, not a suffering servant.
That sets up the turning point perfectly. Because immediately after this two-stage healing, they arrive at the pagan temples of Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asks them the ultimate question, who do you say that I am? And Peter steps up to the plate.
Peter, acting as the bold spokesman for the 12, makes the foundational confession of the Christian faith. He says, you are the Christ, the Messiah.
He finally gets it.
He finally sees clearly. He correctly identifies the king. But the very microsecond he says that, the second half of Mark's gospel begins. The focus shifts violently from the identity of the Messiah to the mission of the Messiah.
Right.
The geography shifts from the safety of Galilee to the dangerous road leading up to Jerusalem.
And Jesus immediately starts talking about dying.
Right. Jesus issues his first explicit passion prediction. He tells them plainly that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again.
And Peter completely loses his mind.
He does. The text says Peter actually took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. And the Greek word for rebuke is strong. It's the same word Jesus uses to silence demons.
Now wait, I want to push back on Peter here for a second because it's easy to judge him. But wasn't Peter just being a fiercely loyal friend?
Well, sure, from a human perspective.
Right, if your best friend, who you just realize is the rightful king of the world, tells you he's going to go to the capital city to get tortured and executed by corrupt politicians, the natural, loving human response is, over my dead body, I won't let them touch you.
From a purely human, biological perspective of loyalty and self-preservation, Peter's reaction makes perfect sense. The sources analyze Peter's mindset deeply here. They point out that Peter, like all first-century Jews, wanted a conquering Messiah without a wounded Messiah. He wanted the crown without the cross. He was looking for national political victory over Rome. He had absolutely no theological category for substitutionary atonement.
He wanted the Roman oppressors gone. He didn't want his rabbi executed by them.
Exactly. But Jesus' response to Peter's quote-unquote loyalty is absolutely devastating. Jesus turns, looks at the rest of the disciples to make sure they hear it, and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man."
Calling your lead disciple, the guy who just correctly confessed you as the Christ, Satan, that is intense. It feels almost like an overreaction. Why such a severe nuclear response?
Because Jesus recognized exactly what was happening. The sources explain that Peter was unwittingly echoing the exact temptation of Satan in the wilderness.
Oh, back at the beginning of his ministry.
Yes. Remember, Satan offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their glory if Jesus would just bow down. Satan was offering him the crown of the world without the agony of the cross at Golgotha.
It was the temptation to bypass the suffering.
Right. When Peter tells Jesus, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you," he is serving as a mouthpiece for that exact same satanic temptation.
Wow. The temptation to take the easy path to glory. Okay, so Jesus rebukes Peter privately in front of the disciples. But then a crucial textual detail happens, and this changes the scope of the whole passage. The text says Jesus summons the crowd he calls the oklos. Why is that specific word, oklos, so important?
The Greek word oklos refers to the general multitude, the broader crowd of curiosity seekers and hangers-on who were outside the inner circle of the 12 disciples.
Okay.
Up to this point, Jesus was having a private, intense theological dispute with his inner circle. But then he turns away, raises his voice, and publicly summons everyone within earshot.
Why does he do that?
The sources argue this is the absolute proof that cross-bearing is not an advanced graduate-level course for elite Christians. It isn't just for apostles or pastors or super saints or future martyrs.
It's the baseline entry requirement.
It is the universal, non-negotiable baseline for anyone who claims to be a disciple. By calling the aklos, he expands the audience to show that you cannot be a Christian without accepting these terms. There is no two-tier system where some Christians take up the cross and others just enjoy the benefits.
So imagine the scene. Jesus has this massive crowd gathered around him. He has Peter reeling, probably standing there in shock from just being called Satan. And Jesus lays out his terms of service.
Yeah.
The sources dig incredibly deep into the original language here to show that Jesus is speaking with absolute surgical grammatical precision. What exactly are the terms he lays out in verse 34?
The authors provide a meticulous discourse analysis of the Greek text to make sure we don't miss the weight of it. Jesus begins with a conditional statement, if anyone would come after me. In the Greek, this is aitisthelei. It is what grammarians call a first-class conditional clause.
Okay, stop right there. Break that down for me. Explain a first-class conditional clause like I'm 5 years old. What does that mean for the listener standing in the crowd?
A first-class condition is a grammatical way of assuming the reality of the condition for the sake of the argument. It's a way of saying, assuming you truly, genuinely desire to follow me, and I assume that you do since you are standing here listening to me, here is the absolute protocol.
Okay, that makes sense.
It establishes the non-negotiable terms for genuine faith. It says, if the desire is real, the following actions are mandatory.
And then he drops 3 massive commands, 3 sequential imperatives. Let's walk through these slowly because the sources spend a lot of time analyzing the specific verbs. What is the very first one?
The first command is, let him deny himself. The Greek verb used here is aparniomai. The authors note this is an aorist middle imperative.
Okay.
The prefix apos added to the root verb arniomai, which means to deny. The prefix intensifies it, so it signifies a decisive, complete, and total denial. It means to utterly and completely disown oneself.
The sources point out this incredible tragic irony here. This exact same verb, aparniomai, is used one other major time in Mark's gospel, and it involves the very guy who just got rebuked.
Yes, it's wild. It is used in Mark chapter 14 during the trial of Jesus. Peter is sitting in the courtyard of the high priest, warming himself by the fire, and a servant girl recognizes him.
Right.
And Peter begins to invoke a curse on himself and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. That is aparniomai. He utterly, completely disowns Jesus to save his own skin.
And the sources say that in true conversion, Jesus is demanding that we take that exact same weapon of denial, that same absolute rejection, and instead of pointing it at Christ, we point it at the mirror. We point it at ourselves.
That is one of the most profound insights from the text. You have to look in the mirror, look at your own ego, your own sovereignty, your own desires, and say, I do not know you, I'm not ruled by you anymore, I owe you nothing.
Wow.
The authors are very clear to point out that Jesus chose this violent verb rather than a softer word for self-improvement or education or discipline. Conversion isn't about making the self better. As the sources put it, conversion is not self-improvement. It is self-execution.
Self-execution. Okay, what is the second imperative?
The second is take up his cross. The verb is eru. Again, this is an aorist active imperative. The grammar here is crucial.
Let's do another explain it like I'm 5 for the aorist tense.
Yeah.
Because I know Greek tenses convey different types of action than English tenses.
Exactly. In Greek grammar, the aorist tense often points to a decisive, foundational, point-in-time act of the will. It isn't a gradual process.
So it's not a slow thing.
No. The sources point out a fascinating grammar trick here. The Greek uses a tense that doesn't mean a gradual change. It means a decisive, one-and-done, point-of-no-return action. It's like flipping a light switch, not turning a dimmer dial.
So you don't gradually ease into picking up a cross. You don't try it on for size on the weekends. You decisively step underneath that heavy beam. You accept the terms of execution. You turn your back on the world's approval once and for all, flipping the switch.
Precisely. It is a fundamental, irrevocable shift in allegiance. You accept that following him will bring the reproach of the world, and you make peace with that reality up front.
And the third imperative.
The third command is follow me. The Greek verb is akoluthar. And here, the grammar shifts in a very revealing way. While the first 2 commands denying and taking up were in the aorist tense, signifying that decisive light switch action, This third command is a present active imperative.
A shift in tense. So what does the present tense communicate in contrast?
Their present tense denotes continuous, habitual, ongoing action. It literally translates to, let him keep on following me continually.
All right, I see.
The sources make a crucial theological point here. True faith is not a momentary decision you make at a youth camp or an altar call, where you cry a little, sign a card, and then go back to living a life of carnal ease for the next 40 years.
It's not a one-and-done transaction. Let me try an analogy here to synthesize these terms, because I think the interplay between the aorist and the present is fascinating.
Let's hear it.
It's like signing a permanent declaration of bankruptcy on your own ego and your own self-rule. You go to the court, you sign the papers, the gavel falls. That's the decisive aorist action. You are bankrupt. The old company's dissolved. But then the present tense means you clock in every single day at a new job to work for a new boss.
That is an excellent way to capture the grammatical flow of the verse. You sign the bankruptcy papers on your autonomy, you accept the terms of the cross, and you spend the rest of your earthly life continuously, daily, habitually working under the sovereign direction of Christ.
Oh.
The decisive death to self naturally issues in a lifetime of active, ongoing obedience.
But this raises a massive logical question. If I am sitting in that crowd in Caesarea Philippi, and I hear these brutal terms, utterly disown myself, pick up an instrument of state terror and execution, and submit my entire life to following this homeless rabbi, why on earth would anyone agree to that?
It's a fair question.
Why take a deal where the explicit terms of service are your own death? It sounds like madness.
It is the most logical question to ask, and the beauty of the text is that Jesus fully anticipates it.
He does.
Yeah. Immediately after issuing these devastating commands, he doesn't just walk away. He grounds his demands in a series of logical explanations. The sources refer to this section as the ultimate paradox of cosmic economics.
Cosmic economics, I love that.
In verses 35 through 37, Jesus uses 4 consecutive ground clauses, all starting with the word for, or gar in Greek, to logically, systematically prove why picking up the cross is the only rational choice a human being can make.
Let's dive into those grounds. What is the core paradox he presents in verse 35?
Jesus says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." The sources spend a considerable amount of time unpacking the specific Greek word Jesus uses for life here, which is psyche.
Psyche, which is where we get words like psychology and psyche.
Right. But in the first century context, psyche has an intentional, built-in dual meaning. It can refer to your temporal, biological, physical life on earth, your breathing, eating, walking existence. Or it can refer to your eternal, transcendent, immortal soul. Jesus leverages this dual meaning to set up a stark contrast between 2 verbs, souche, which means to save or rescue, and apolese, which means to destroy, ruin, or lose.
So walk me through the logic. If you try to souche your psyche,
If you make it your ultimate goal to save your physical temporal life, if you compromise your convictions to avoid persecution, if you cling to your earthly autonomy, your wealth, your comfort, your social standing, you will inevitably apolace your eternal soul.
it's a zero-sum game.
Completely. And the sources emphasize a critical point about biblical theology here. Apollumi, the root of that word for destroy, doesn't mean annihilation. It doesn't mean you just cease to exist and fade to black.
What does it mean then?
In the biblical framework, it means eternal ruin. It means being cut off from the favorable presence of God and facing conscious eternal judgment.
It's the great human delusion, isn't it? The natural human instinct, our fundamental biological and psychological hardwiring, is autonomous self-preservation. From the moment we are born, we seek to protect ourselves, feed ourselves, and elevate ourselves.
That's right.
But Jesus is looking at the crowd and saying, your deepest biological instinct for self-preservation is actually a spiritual suicide pact.
A suicide pact is the perfect way to describe it, because you are feverishly working to preserve a physical shell that is guaranteed to expire in maybe 80 or 90 years, and to do so, you are actively sacrificing a soul that will last for trillions of years.
And he drives this mathematical absurdity home with commercial language in the next 2 verses.
He does. In verses 36 and 37, Jesus shifts metaphors. He moves from the language of execution to the language of Wall Street, of economics and accounting.
Yeah.
He asks, "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" The sources highlight the specific Greco-Roman commercial terms used in the original text. You have iphile for profit or advantage, kirdesai for accumulating gain, and zimio for forfeiting or suffering a total loss.
I really want to look at that word zumio. What kind of loss are we talking about in a first century commercial context? Is it like a bad quarter on the stock market?
No, it's far worse. Zumio was a specific term used in ancient commercial trade and maritime law to describe a merchant who suffers catastrophic, irrecoverable financial loss.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a merchant who puts his entire life savings into a cargo ship, and the ship sinks to the bottom of the Mediterranean. It is total bankruptcy, unrecoverable ruin.
I love the ultimate thought experiment Jesus sets up here. It is the greatest hypothetical scenario ever posed. He says, imagine the ultimate portfolio. Imagine a single human being achieving what no one in history has ever achieved, acquiring total uncontested ownership of all earthly kingdoms, all global wealth, all real estate, all honors, and all physical pleasures. You literally gained the whole world, maximum earthly return.
It is the absolute astronomical exaggeration of human success. It's Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Elon Musk combined, magnified by a million.
Right. But Jesus says, even if you pull that off, if you achieve the maximum possible earthly gain, if the cost of that transaction at the end of your life is forfeiting your psyche, your eternal soul in the fires of divine judgment, then mathematically you are an infinite loser. It makes it the most insane, irrational economic transaction in human history.
The mathematics of eternity completely shatter the mathematics of time. Any finite number, even the wealth of the whole world compared to eternity, is functionally zero.
Functionally zero. Wow.
And the sources note that Jesus seals this devastating economic argument with one final terrifying question in verse 37. For what can a man give in return for his soul?
And the key word there is return or exchange. I know the sources lean heavily on this specific Greek noun.
The Greek noun is antelagma. The authors do a deep dive, tracing this word back through extra-biblical Hellenistic Greek literature and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, specifically pointing to books like Sirach.
Okay, and what does it mean in that context?
Antelagma designated an equivalent exchange rate. It was a ransom price, an exact commercial substitute required to buy a slave out of bondage or to settle a massive debt.
So Jesus is asking a legal transactional question. Once your soul is forfeited, once the gavel falls and you are declared bankrupt and guilty before the tribunal of God, what is the antelagma? What is the ransom price you can slide across the table to buy it back?
And the grammatical construction of the question in Greek implies a rhetorical answer of absolute, terrifying negation. Nothing. The answer is zero.
Zero.
Once a man stands before the holy tribunal of God, having forfeited his soul, all the gold, silver, real estate, and political power of 10,000 worlds cannot pay the ransom price to redeem him from divine justice.
Okay, I have to pause the train right here because we are heading toward a cliff. If the cost of a forfeited soul is infinite, and we as human beings possess exactly zero currency to buy it back, aren't we just completely doomed?
It sure sounds like it.
I mean, who can possibly survive this standard? We all fail to perfectly deny ourselves. We all fail to carry the cross perfectly.
That realization of complete and utter moral bankruptcy is exactly where the text wants to take you. It leads directly to the core theological heartbeat of this passage, and frankly, of the entire Reformed theological framework that the authors of these sources operate from.
Let's get into the mechanics of that theology. Because a superficial surface-level reading of Take Up Your Cross might lead someone to a very dark place of religious works.
Oh, definitely.
They might think, okay, the ransom price is infinite. I need to suffer enough, or deny myself enough, or punish myself enough to earn my salvation. My cross-bearing is the currency that saves me.
The sources are fiercely adamant in rejecting that idea. They carefully explain that our cross-bearing does not merit salvation. It is not a form of works righteousness.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction.
It is not medieval religious penance where you flagellate yourself to appease an angry deity. The authors warn that turning cross-bearing into a work by which sinners try to merit acceptance with God is the fatal error of legalism.
Because we established we have no antelagma. We have no ransom price of our own. Even our suffering is tainted with sin.
Exactly. The text invokes the underlying theology of Psalm 49, which states explicitly, "Truly no man can ransom another, or give to God the price of his redemption, for the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice."
Wow.
The sources highlight the absolute inability and total depravity of fallen man. We are spiritually bankrupt. We are completely incapable of purchasing redemption or satisfying the infinite justice of God through our own suffering, our own good works, or our own cross-bearing.
So if we can't pay the ransom, and no other mere human can pay the ransom for us, how is anyone saved? How does this story not end in universal destruction?
The authors connect the theology of Mark chapter 8 to a definitive statement Jesus makes just 2 chapters later in Mark 10:45, which serves as the thematic climax of the book.
What does he say there?
There, Jesus says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The Greek word he uses there is litron, which is synonymous with antalagma.
So he pays the ransom.
Exactly. It is the fulfillment of the unpayable debt. What we could never do, Christ did. He offered his own precious, sinless blood as the infinite, spotless ransom.
He pays the impossible debt. He is the antalagma. Let's talk about the specific title he uses for himself here, because he doesn't call himself the Son of God in this moment. He says, the Son of Man must suffer. The sources point out that this is a deeply mysterious, highly layered title in biblical theology.
It really is. It is the key to his self-understanding. The title, Son of Man, draws directly from the apocalyptic visions of the prophet Daniel, specifically chapter 7.
What happens in Daniel 7?
In Daniel's vision, the Son of Man is a figure of everlasting dominion and blinding heavenly glory. He approaches the Ancient of Days riding on the clouds of heaven, and he receives a kingdom that will never be destroyed, and all nations and languages serve him.
So it's a title of absolute power.
To a first-century Jew, the Son of Man is a title of supreme, untouchable, divine majesty.
But in Mark 8, Jesus takes this title of supreme majesty and says the Son of Man must be rejected, spit upon, tortured, and killed.
That is the breathtaking mystery of redemptive history that the sources emphasize. Jesus takes the glorious conquering Son of Man from Daniel 7 and seamlessly merges it with the despised, crushed, suffering servant from Isaiah 53.
Oh, wow.
The one who is worthy of all angelic adoration chose to be stricken by God, pierced for our transgressions, and crushed for our iniquities.
I really want to make sure we don't just throw out theological terms without explaining the mechanics of how they actually work. The sources rely heavily on a specific doctrine here. How exactly does this grace function? What is the mechanism of salvation?
The sources outline the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. This is crucial. Christ didn't just die to set a good moral example of cross-bearing or to show us how much God loves us in a general sense. He died as a legal substitute.
A legal substitute. Break that down.
The authors reference Galatians 3:13 to explain the mechanics. The law of God demands absolute perfection, and the penalty for breaking that law is death and curse. Christ, living a perfectly sinless life, stepped into the courtroom, took the record of our crimes upon himself, and bore the unmitigated curse of the broken law.
So he steps into the execution chamber that we earn.
Yes, he surrendered his own life to the horrors of divine wrath, enduring the penal, meaning legal penalty substitutionary death that our sins deserved. The infinite justice of God was poured out on the Son, exhausting the dead. Therefore, the sources argue, salvation is based solely on sovereign grace. It is not earned, it is received through faith alone, and it is rooted entirely in the imputed righteousness of Christ.
Meaning, Christ's perfect record is legally credited to the believer's account.
Exactly.
So, to bring it full circle, where does our cross-bearing fit in? If my suffering doesn't save me, if my self-denial doesn't pay the ransom, why do I have to do it?
The sources define the relationship beautifully. Our obedience, our self-denial, our daily cross-bearing is the grateful, spirit-worked fruit of that redemption.
The fruit, not the root.
Exactly. It is not the root cause of our salvation. It is the inevitable, visible evidence that we have been saved by the infinite ransom paid by the Son of Man. Because we've been bought with such a staggering price, we no longer belong to ourselves. We gladly surrender the autonomy we used to worship.
If this infinite ransom was truly paid, if the creator of the universe stepped into the execution chamber to pay a debt you could never pay, the natural human response should be overwhelming, radical gratitude. You should want to shout it from the rooftops.
You'd think so, right?
Yet, the sources point out a bizarre, tragic paradox in the human condition. People are actually embarrassed by it. Why would anyone be ashamed of a ransom that saved their life? Which brings us to the final verse of our passage, verse 38.
Verse 38 moves the camera from our present earthly choices to the final eschatological courtroom of divine judgment. Jesus issues a terrifying warning. "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels."
He uses the word ashamed. The Greek here is epashente.
Yes, it's an aorist passive subjunctive. It speaks of a fundamental, visceral recoil from identifying with Christ.
Like trying to distance yourself from him.
It's the desire to hide your association with him because it costs you social capital. And notice how Jesus describes the culture we live in. He calls it an adulterous and sinful generation.
The sources note this is not primarily talking about sexual
Yeah,
adultery.
no, it is a profound Old Testament covenantal allusion drawing from prophets like Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
It describes spiritual unfaithfulness, the idea that humanity is married to its creator but constantly runs after the false gods of the culture.
Exactly, spiritual idolatry.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying that if we compromise our identification with him, if we water down his words because we are embarrassed by him in front of a culture that hates him, he will respond in kind.
Wow.
To be ashamed of Christ in time to protect your social standing now guarantees eternal rejection. He will disown you when he returns in eschatological glory.
Now, this is the point in the deep dive where the sources get extremely pointed, and I want to firmly establish our boundary here. The authors of these sources take this ancient text with its absolute demands for self-denial and its terrifying warning against being ashamed of Christ's words, and they aim it like a sledgehammer at modern religious and cultural movements.
They absolutely do.
Let's impartially look at exactly what they argue here, because they are applying this text as a harsh corrective to specific, massive contemporary groups. We are strictly reporting their theological critique.
Right, they use the text as a theological weapon against what they see as modern compromise. First and foremost, they target the prosperity gospel.
Right, the health and wealth movement. How do they use Mark 8 to refute it?
The sources state in no uncertain terms that the prosperity gospel is a demonically inspired lie.
Those are strong words.
Very strong. And they argue this specifically because it preaches a crossless Christ. The text says Jesus demands self-denial and the forfeiture of earthly gain. The prosperity gospel, conversely, promises earthly fulfillment, financial wealth, and physical health.
The exact opposite.
Exactly. The authors argue that to preach a Jesus whose primary goal is to make you rich in this life is to preach an antichrist, because the biblical Jesus explicitly demands you pick up an instrument of torture and die to your earthly ambitions.
Okay, moving down their list, the sources also draw very strict historical theological boundaries against Roman Catholicism and Arminianism. What is their argument against those frameworks? Let's start with Catholicism.
The critique of Catholicism goes straight back to the concept of the antilagma, the ransom price. The sources critique the Roman Catholic sacramental system, arguing that it teaches a person can merit grace or atone for temporal sins through penance, purgatory, and human works.
Right.
The authors argue this directly violates Jesus' declaration that no man can give anything in exchange for his soul. For these Reformed authors, salvation must be entirely of sovereign grace, received through faith alone, without any mixture of human merit.
And regarding Arminianism, why does a text about picking up a cross lead them to attack the concept of human free will?
This is where they dig into the psychology of the text. The authors look at the absolute severity of the command, total violent self-denial.
Yes, self-execution.
Right. Their argument is that because fallen human nature is biologically, psychologically, and spiritually hardwired for autonomous self-preservation, no human being possesses the natural, unassisted, quote-unquote, free will to choose their own execution.
The natural man will always choose to save his psyche.
Exactly. Therefore, they argue, the ability and the desire to take up the cross cannot originate in the human will. It must be implanted by a sovereign act of God. They argue that without the Holy Spirit's sovereign regeneration giving a spiritually dead sinner a new heart, no one can or will choose the cross.
What about the charismatic movement? The sources address that branch of the church as well, dealing with how the Holy Spirit supposedly operates today.
Yes, the sources argue from a strictly cessationist framework the belief that the miraculous sign gifts, like speaking in tongues and healing, ceased with the apostolic era.
Okay.
They state that the modern charismatic pursuit of extra-biblical revelations, or what they term ecstatic gibberish, is a distraction from true spiritual power.
So what is true spiritual power to them?
According to their application of Mark 8, true Holy Spirit empowerment is not found in falling backward or speaking in tongues. The true power of the Spirit is demonstrated in the gritty, daily ability to mortify the flesh, to take up the cross, and to stand unashamed for the authority of Scripture in a hostile culture.
And they don't just keep their critiques inside the church. They aim at secular culture and sociological movements too.
They do. The authors urge believers not to compromise biblical truth in an attempt to appease the modern gods of secularism. They specifically name contemporary ideologies like critical race theory, gender ideology, and moral therapeutic deism.
And how does Mark 8 apply to that?
Their argument is that the culture will always demand that the church alter Christ's words to fit the current moral zeitgeist. But true disciples must refuse to be ashamed of Christ's unpopular exclusive truth claims, even if it costs them their jobs, their reputations, or their social standing.
Okay, so that is a very broad, sweeping, polemical application from the sources. But let's bring it down to the ground level. Let's talk about the radical daily application for the individual listener. According to the text perspective, what does cross-bearing actually look like on a random Tuesday morning? We aren't being fed to lions in the Colosseum today. How do we die to self?
The authors list very practical, intimate demands. First, it requires the ruthless mortification of secret sins.
Mortification, meaning the active putting to death of something. Like the Puritan John Owen said, be killing sin or it will be killing you.
Exactly. Actively hunting down and starving out sins like secret pride, materialism, greed, lust, and bitterness. To deny self means saying an absolute, agonizing no to the fleshly passions that war against the soul, even when no one else is watching.
Right. And what's the second practical demand?
Second, they apply this directly to the structure of the home, arguing that biblical complementarianism in marriage is a direct daily expression of cross-bearing love.
How do they define that in the context of the cross?
They argue that husbands are commanded to explicitly crucify selfish authoritarianism and passivity, laying down their lives and their preferences to serve their wives, just as Christ loved the church.
Okay.
Conversely, wives are called to crucify modern cultural ideals of absolute carnal independence, submitting joyfully to the servant leadership of their husbands. It is mutual self-denial acting out the gospel in the living room.
And what about public identification? Is there a ritual aspect to this?
Yes, publicly they point to the ordinance of believers' baptism as the ultimate foundational identification with the cross.
That makes sense. A public declaration.
They argue that going under the water is not just a nice tradition. It is a public funeral. It is a declaration of your total death to the old life of autonomous sin, and coming up out of the water is your resurrection to walk in a new life under the lordship of Christ, completely regardless of the social cost or the mockery of the world.
It's all about living in the tension between the cross and glory. We can endure the loss of reputation or the loss of comfort or financial hits or even our physical lives in the present because we are anchored to an eschatological hope.
That is the grand finale of the text. It ends with the unbreakable promise of the Son of Man returning in the blazing glory of his Father with the holy angels.
Right.
We can endure the cross now. We can suffer loss now because we know with absolute certainty that the King is returning to judge the quick and the dead. The verdicts of this world, the cancellations, the mockery, they are temporary and meaningless. His verdict is eternal.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today on reform thinking. We've moved from the gritty, blood-soaked realities of first-century Rome under the madness of Nero to the plush, multi-million-dollar pulpit of modern prosperity preachers.
We really have.
We've gone from the precise surgical grammar of a Greek aorist imperative flipping the light switch of self-denial to the staggering, terrifying cosmic economics of an eternal soul. But after all of the historical context, after all the theological parsing and cultural critiques, the ultimate, inescapable ultimatum remains exactly what Jesus of Nazareth asked 2,000 years ago, standing in the shadow of pagan temples. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?
It remains the ultimate question of value. What is the exchange rate you are willing to accept for your eternity? What is the price tag on your soul?
And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final searching thought to mull over on your own as you go about the rest of your day. When Jesus poses this cosmic question, he uses the absolute maximum limit of human ambition. He talks about gaining the whole world, the ultimate kingdom. But let's be devastatingly honest with ourselves. Most of us aren't tempted by the whole world. We aren't being offered global empires or trillions of dollars by the devil. We're tempted to trade our eternal soul for incredibly small, pathetic, microscopic things. A fleeting promotion at work, the momentary approval of anonymous strangers on the internet, a temporary physical comfort, a bitter grudge we stubbornly refuse to let go of because it feeds our pride.
That is so true.
So look closely at your life right now. What is the tiny, insignificant piece of the quote-unquote world you're currently trying to gain? What is the little life hack, the little compromise you're holding on to, hoping you will optimize your autonomy just enough so you don't have to fully surrender to the king? And ask yourself, is that tiny, fading sliver of the world worth the infinite ransom you can never, ever pay? Thank you for joining us for this intense foundational session of reformed thinking. Remember, true life isn't found in optimizing your self-rule. It is found only on the other side of the cross. Until next time.